Why on earth is Russia saying that President Joe Biden is on the cusp of starting World War III? I'm Niall Paterson, and that is the topic on this edition of the Sky News Daily. The reason? Ukraine has been given permission to use long-range missiles supplied by the United States on Russian targets inside Russia. And as a result, the Kremlin is accusing the West of pouring oil on fire. In a moment, we will hear from our correspondent in Moscow about the reaction from the Kremlin. But first, what exactly are ATACMS missiles, and could they really start a new global conflict? Tim Ripley is a defence analyst and editor of the Defence Eye website, knows a thing or two about missiles as well. Tim, great to have you with us.
Sure.
First and foremost, what exactly are these weapons, the US Army Tactical Missile System, and what are they used for?
Right. These are battlefield ballistic missiles. They have a range of up to 300 kilometres, that's 190 miles. They go very high up into the atmosphere and then drop back down to Earth with great velocity, making them very effective at penetrating bunkers and hardened, protected targets.
So why has Ukraine been so keen on using them? Not, of course, on Ukrainian territory, but across the border in Russian territory.
Okay, well, Ukraine has been coming under a relentless Russian air, missile, drone attack of varying intensities over the past almost 3 years. So they want to have the ability to strike back at those airfields and missile bases that are firing at their cities to sort of have a response to that strategic Russian attack on key Ukrainian infrastructure and energy targets and the like.
So to tackle key Russian infrastructure of the type that you were mentioning, air bases, bunkers and so on.
Correct. They want to turn this into a war of equals rather than having the Russian supremacy that is causing such problems for them.
All of which then sounds eminently sensible that the Ukrainians should be allowed these weapons. So why has the West dragged its heels on this issue and until this point said, no, you simply can't?
So how do you think the Russians are going to react if the debris of a British missile is pulled out of the Kremlin and the manufacturing plate that says made in Stevenage is displayed on Russian TV? And what would be the reaction of the Russians to that? They would want revenge against whoever made and fired this missile. And, we can all intellectualize it a bit and say, oh, they'll believe it's the Ukrainians. But if it says made in Stevenage, as these missiles are, they would want to extract their revenge against whoever made them and provided them to the Ukrainians.
Still, the Russians will have been as aware as anyone else of the ongoing requests by the Ukrainians to use US missiles of this type, to use British missiles of this type. And presumably they have responded strategically to this pending risk.
Yes. I've seen some satellite photographs of Russian air bases. A set was put out by some Ukrainian analysts only a week, 10 days ago. And the ones near the Ukrainian border seem to be rather empty of planes. And the ones a long way away from Ukraine seem to be full of planes. So, the Russians have reacted in anticipation of this move. For the past 6, 7, 8 months, we've been talking about this incessantly on programs such as this. And so the Russians have worked it out that their air bases might be vulnerable and have reacted accordingly and moved loads of their planes away from the missile envelope of these ATACMS missiles. So this may be a sort of stable door after horses bolted moment. It's very good for the morale of the Ukrainians and they get to hit back at the Russians. But is it going to have the same effect as if this decision had been made last February? Probably not.
So strategically then, Tim, was it a mistake for the West to, as you say, drag its heels for as long as it did on the use of these weapons?
We've seen it time and time again. That Britain, France, Germany, United States have approached this war in an incremental, just enough way of it. So whenever the Ukrainians ask for something, it takes months for us to decide whether they're going to get Challenger tanks or long-range missiles or F-16 fighter planes. And by the time we get round to giving them to them, the moment has passed. But there's also, the Ukrainians are using this sort of issue as a way to keep their cause at the top of the agenda. They talk up these weapons as wonder weapons. It's going to change the course of the war when maybe they realise it isn't. But it's good to keep Ukraine in the news. It's good for their propaganda war. It keeps up morale at home that they're finally getting around some support from the West. But we have to be realistic that these arms supplies are not the ones that are going to change the course of the war on the ground in the Donbass, on those front lines where the Russians are grinding forward and are really putting the pressure on the Ukrainian frontline troops. That war has set in motion, that war of attrition has dynamics about it that this, issue of these missiles are not going to affect anytime soon.
Do you then understand, Tim, the fury that is being displayed by the Russians right now, given this acceleration or ramping up of the conflict?
Loads of it is indeed performative. I mean, why would they escalate the war? At the moment, they have more men, more tanks, more planes, more missiles, more of everything against the Ukrainians. But if they had to factor in NATO as well, they would be outnumbered. So it's really not in their interests to expand this war in a way that brings in NATO openly on the side of the Ukrainians, as an attack on firing a missile at the missile factory in Stevenage would probably do.
Tim, many thanks indeed. Stay where you are. In just a moment, we'll be heading to Moscow to find out the reaction there. Welcome back to The Daily, where we're continuing to talk about those US Army Tactical Missile System missiles, ATACMS as the acronym goes, which President Biden has sanctioned for use by Ukraine against Russian targets in Russia. Let's try and take the temperature then in Russia with our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett. Ivor, what exactly have the Russians been saying about this?
We've had the official response today from Dmitry Peskov, the chief spokesman from the Kremlin. He told journalists that the US are the ones ratcheting up the tension, which is something you hear a lot from the Kremlin. And he also said that it's the US guilty of escalation, not Russia here. There was no mention of the thousands of North Korean troops who are reportedly been deployed by Moscow on the front line. None of that. This was all about the move from the US, which Russia has said is an escalation. And it feels like this is really a script now that the Kremlin runs through. We all expect it here as journalists, and I think the Kremlin knows it's going to say it as well. And it's because it's part of its public messaging campaign, I think, as it tries to get the public to continue to buy into the narrative it's built around the war here, that Russia is the innocent party, that Russia is the one who is under attack.
So if we know, as you say, Ivor, the script that the Russians deploy at times like this, do we then know what their likely response will be if these ATACMS are used on Russia?
Yes and no. That's the thing. The threats are always the same. There's talk of serious consequences. There's talk of escalation or responding in kind or retaliatory measures. The threats are always very undefined, though, very loose and nebulous, and that's partly to make them more threatening. What could happen is that, what Vladimir Putin has mentioned before on this topic is he's raised the prospect of sending weapons to the West's adversaries to strike Western targets abroad, never mentioning any names again, very undefined, but the implication, I think, was that it could be Iran. Russia has also changed its nuclear doctrine, remember, a couple of months ago to allow it, in theory, to respond with nuclear weapons if Western missiles fall on its territory. But the assumption is in the West that this is actually all just bluffs, because Russian red lines have been crossed before in this conflict and nothing has happened. And the assumption in the White House seems to be that this is just more bluff and bluster, more saber rattling rather than anything else.
Ivor, that's a pretty big assumption, though, isn't it, on the part of the White House? I mean, yeah, it doesn't feel like we're on the cusp of nuclear war presaging a third global conflict. But at the same time, you tend to try and avoid those sorts of situations coming up in international diplomacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why they've held off so long from giving Kiev this permission to strike deeper inside Russia with these US-made weapons. It's why everyone's held off. It's that chance that what if we're wrong? What if the Kremlin is not bluffing here? But the calculation is, and I've heard this many times over the last few months speaking to Western diplomats here on this issue, is that Russia doesn't want nuclear confrontation any more than anyone else does. No one wants it. It's all part of this kind of public posturing, more aimed at the domestic audience than those abroad, to, as I say, keep the Russian public on side, to buy into this idea that they are the ones who are under attack. That's not to say Russia might respond in other ways. They could respond in more subtle ways, for example, like Europe is already accusing Russia of sabotage and cyber attacks. Could those increase? As we know, Russia is cozying up with North Korea. They're also getting much closer with Iran. The two countries seem to be on the brink of signing a strategic partnership deal, and the West has already accused Iran of sending Moscow ballistic missiles. Could Moscow send nuclear know-how and expertise back to Iran, back the other way? So there are lots of other ways Russia could respond that are under the radar, and a lot different to what the kind of public posturing is. And I think that's the fear. It's not the kind of the frothing at the mouth that the Western officials fear. It's what happens behind the scenes, behind closed doors and out of sight.
But look, whenever we find ourselves in situations like this, and we're trying to work out the mindset in and around Vladimir Putin, we often look at state media, Russian state media, the talk shows, the talking points provided by the Kremlin, the talking heads supported by the Kremlin. And if you were listening to them and them alone, you would think we were on the cusp of World War III.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that is deliberate. What we hear on state media here is pretty terrifying. It wasn't that long ago that a commentator actually advocated building a kind of plywood set of London and New York and Washington and destroying them with TNT to try and get a feel for what might happen and try and make sure those in the West know that Russia is serious. And we've had more of that kind of rhetoric today from the usual hawks and hardliners who are often wheeled out when Russia needs to kind of ratchet up the rhetoric. Maria Butina, who's an MP here, she said this could lead to World War III. Others have said that too. And a lot of these kind of takes from the hardliners are dismissed as quite laughable. But you're right. I think the fact that this kind of language is being used on state media by Russian MPs, some of them in the upper house who sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, it's an indication of some of the thinking inside the Kremlin. Okay, the official response from the Kremlin has been a bit more measured, but the fact these conversations and this kind of language is being used, I think that will be a concern to some degree in the West, because it, as I say, it gives an indication of what some inside the Kremlin are thinking, and it gives an indication of what the words are being whispered into Vladimir Putin's ear.
Ivor, thank you. And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. If you want much more on the decision by the Americans to give the green light for Ukraine to use those long-range US missiles, just head to skynews.com. We'll see you again, same time tomorrow.